The wind that swept across the prairie carried more than dust that evening. It carried memory. Long, slow memory that clung to the earth like smoke. Clara May stood with her boots sunk ankle-deep in the soil that had taken her mother, her father, and now something else, something quieter but no less cruel. Before her lay a wooden cross, freshly carved, with no name etched into it, just the weight of silence. Her hands, raw and pink from labor, cradled a bundle pressed tight against her chest. Lena, her daughter, had yet to cry with a full voice. She whimpered in her sleep now, and then, a bird just testing its song. Clara had whispered every prayer she knew into the fabric that wrapped the child, not because she believed they would be answered, but because silence had begun to frighten her more than anything. Thomas hadn't even looked at the baby. His eyes had passed over the child like she was a stone or a shadow. Not a child, not a son, just another failure. He'd stood there, arms crossed, and stared at Clara like she was the one who had done something wrong. A girl, was all he said. And then he walked out. No goodbye, no threat, just his boots and the slow, bitter sound of a door closing that hadn't opened since. It wasn't the leaving that hurt, it was how easily he did it. Like she'd become transparent the moment her body gave him something he didn't want. The pain of childbirth had left her weak. The bleeding nearly took her. Old Marybelle had stayed by her side, mopping her brow, whispering, "Hold on now, sugar, you're made of tougher things than this." The old woman's hands were gentle but firm, as if she'd coaxed many broken bodies back into place over the years. But even Marybelle couldn't fix what had been broken between Clara and the world. The women in town didn't come after. Not with food, not with help. One had come by the gate and left a single loaf of bread on the fence post, then turned her back like leaving food for a stray dog. Clara saw her lips move. Poor thing, cursed maybe, before she disappeared into the brush. Cursed. That word circled Clara like a vulture. She'd felt it even before it was spoken. When Thomas turned away. When the sky stayed dry and her garden shriveled. When Lena's first cries sounded more like apologies. There was no gold in her fields. No sun in her arms. No man to build fences or break horses. Just her and the child, and the slow ache in her bones that came from healing without kindness. But Clara did not fold. She woke each morning before the sun, fed the goats, carried water with trembling arms. She boiled linen, mended what she could, and she held Lena, always Lena, like the one piece of the world that hadn't left. The girl's eyes were wide and searching, still new, but in them Clara found something old and patient, something worth staying for. Her land stretched in every direction, mostly flat, with grass that danced in the breeze like it didn't know what it meant to grieve. The trees to the west were few and lean, twisted by wind and time. There was beauty in them, Clara thought. Not the soft kind, but the kind that came from surviving. Sometimes she sat on the porch, Lena sleeping in the crook of her elbow, and watched the sky bleed into evening. Those were the moments she missed music the most. Her mother had sung while shelling peas or hanging clothes, little hums that never needed lyrics. Clara tried to remember the melodies, but they came to her in fragments, like dreams slipping from her fingers. She hummed anyway, for Lena. The days passed like that, gentle as bruises, the kind you forget until you brush against them. One afternoon, Clara found a hare tangled in the fence wire, its leg broken. The animal thrashed as she approached, eyes wide with terror. She knew that look. She saw it in her own reflection sometimes, when she passed the mirror too quickly. She wrapped the animal in her shawl, murmuring softly, and ended its pain with a clean cut of her knife. That night, she roasted the meat, ate what she could, and saved the rest. For the first time in weeks, Lena cooed in her sleep, full and warm. The wind shifted the next day. She felt it before she saw it. Some presence at the edge of her land. Not a shape exactly, just a suggestion. A figure far enough not to be a threat, but close enough to unsettle. He stood where the tall grass met the ridge, arms loose at his sides, the wind playing in his long dark hair. A quiet watcher. She didn't move toward him, didn't call out. She simply turned and went inside, heart beating steady, a strange calm settling over her like dusk. That evening, there was a small bundle on her porch. Herbs bound with twine, roots and leaves she didn't recognize, but that smelled of wild places and healing. She crouched beside it, fingers lingering on the offering. She said nothing, just stared out across the prairie, wondering if he still stood there, hidden by twilight. The next morning, she placed a strip of dried apple in a handkerchief and tied it to the fence post. Nothing in her life had ever begun with kindness and stayed. But still, she offered it, softly, without demand. When she was a child, her mother told her that wild things come closer if you don't chase them. Let them come to you, she'd said, combing Clara's hair. Sit real still. Let him know you ain't afraid. So Clara sat real still, night after night, Lena pressed against her, waiting not for rescue, but for something even rarer, a presence that didn't want to take anything from her. The man didn't come close. Not yet. But she felt him there, watching. Not like Thomas did, judging and expecting, but like someone seeing her for the first time and not turning away. That was enough. For now. The moon rose full and pale, and Clara walked out onto the dirt path in front of her cabin. She looked out into the dark where the prairie whispered secrets, and she said, without raising her voice, "We're still here." It wasn't a plea. It wasn't even an invitation. It was a truth. The baby stirred, and Clara rocked her gently. Above them, the stars came out one by one, slow and deliberate, as if they too had been holding their breath. And somewhere in the wind, carried with the scent of wild mint and far-off fires, was the sound of footsteps moving closer. Just a little, just enough to be heard. The days came with less ache now. Not none, but less. Clara began to notice the wind before the weight, the color of the sky before the gray of memory. Her hands still trembled, sometimes when they pulled water from the well, but her shoulders no longer stooped from absence. The baby grew stronger, eyes widening to take in the world, fingers grasping the fabric of her mother's dress like they meant to hold on for good. Clara worked quietly, efficiently. There was peace in repetition, mending, boiling, rocking. She didn't speak often, save for the lullabies and humming and small comforts whispered to Lena. But her silence no longer felt empty. It had begun to fill with something new, something patient. Then came the day she saw him again. He stood at the edge of her land, just as before, where the tall grass whispered over the rise. Still as a stone. He didn't hide, but he didn't come closer either. He watched, not hungrily, not like men do when they think they've found something they can claim. He watched like a man who recognized something delicate in another and didn't want to shatter it by stepping too loud. Clara didn't wave. She simply looked back. Later, she found another bundle on her porch. This time it was yarrow, sage, and a few dried berries. The wrapping was careful, folded with intention. Not the work of someone trying to impress. Just someone who knew what healing looked like and left it gently. She hesitated only a moment before untying the handkerchief from her pantry shelf, filling it with cornbread still warm from the hearth. She placed it not on the porch, but at the edge of the fence, near the worn gate where the path met the wild. She didn't see him take it. But the next morning, the cloth was gone, and in its place sat a carved figure of a fox, no larger than her palm. It had no eyes, but it looked alive somehow, sly and calm, carved from dark wood rubbed smooth by careful hands. Lena cooed when Clara held it out to her. The baby's fingers wrapped around it, tight and sure. That night, Clara lit her lantern early and sat on the steps, not working, not watching, just waiting. The prairie held its breath. Somewhere a coyote cried, thin and mournful. She didn't see him, not that night. But he had left something new, a small pouch of tobacco, laid gently beside the doorstep. No claim, no message, just presence. The days passed like the slow drip of honey, measured, sweet in their stillness. Then came the morning he stepped closer. Clara was in the garden patch, bent over rows of struggling onions. When she felt it, the quiet shift in the air that said she was no longer alone. She rose slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. He stood 10 paces away, far enough to leave space, close enough that she could see the lines on his face. He was not young, though his steps were sure. His skin carried sun and wind and time. His eyes were dark, not cold, but old in a way that meant he'd walked through fire and never raised his voice about it. He said nothing. Neither did she. They stood like that, silence wrapped around them like wool, until Lena stirred from the cradle by the porch. The man's eyes shifted to the child, not sharply, not with surprise. Just a slow noticing, like watching the moon rise. Clara didn't speak, but she bent and picked up her daughter. She didn't lift her high or forward, just held her against her chest, where the baby's head lay nestled beneath her chin. That was when he nodded. Once. A gesture without weight, but full of something unspoken. Then he turned, quiet as he'd come, and disappeared beyond the ridge. Marybelle came by 2 days later, brought soup and a bundle of fabric. "Man's been seen walking near your land," she said, sitting herself down with a grunt. "Tall Cheyenne fellow. Folks get nervous when they see what they don't understand." Clara said nothing, just ladled soup into a bowl. Marybelle eyed her, spooned broth into her mouth, and chewed slow. "I ain't nervous," she muttered eventually. "Saw him myself once, years back. Didn't speak, just watched a fox dig in my garden. Sat down and watched like he was waiting to see how it ended." Clara smiled, but didn't show her teeth. "Some men speak with thunder," Marybelle said. "Others, with roots. Man like that don't rush nothing." Clara thought of the carved fox in Lena's hand. The days continued. Sometimes she'd see him by the trees. Sometimes only his shadow. She began leaving things out again: bread, dried apples, a hand-stitched scrap of cloth. In return, she found feathers, more carved animals, a string of beads, so old they seemed born from the earth. She began tending her land with more purpose. Weeding, watering. Not because she believed everything would thrive, but because the act of care itself mattered. One day, the roof began to leak. She hadn't the tools to fix it, nor the strength to climb. So she waited for sun and prayed the rain wouldn't come. Then she heard the sound of footsteps overhead. She rushed outside, heart pounding. He was on her roof, Chayton. She didn't know his name yet, but that's what it was. He worked with care, replacing broken shingles, tightening beams, moving with a grace that came not from strength, but from familiarity with silence. She stood below, arms crossed. Watched him for a time. "Thank you," she said, eventually. He didn't answer, just kept working. When he was done, he climbed down without ceremony. He stood before her, hands dusty. She offered him a tin cup of water. He took it, drank slow, then handed it back. Still no words. She didn't need them. That night, she sat on the porch again. The stars blinked slowly above her like tired eyes. Lena slept in the cradle. A soft wind stirred the hem of Clara's dress. He was there again, nearer this time. Not at the fence, but beside the old elm tree 10 yards off. The lantern on the porch flickered, and for a moment, their shadows reached for each other across the grass. Clara looked up, voice low. "Why do you come?" He waited a long time. Then he said, in a voice rough as stone rubbed smooth by river water, "You don't turn away." She wanted to ask what he saw when he looked at her, if it was pity or curiosity. But she didn't, because something in her knew. He wasn't looking for broken things to fix. He was simply honoring what hadn't fallen. She rose, walked to the porch rail, and rested her hand there. "I don't turn," she said quietly, "because there's nowhere else to go." His eyes softened then, just slightly. He nodded again, then turned toward the trees. But before he disappeared, she called after him, "What should I call you?" He paused. Then, over his shoulder, he said, "Chayton." She watched him go. The fox figurine lay in the cradle beside Lena, who stirred but did not wake. Clara reached down, picked it up, and held it in her hand. Its curves were worn smooth now, its face familiar. And in the distance, where moonlight touched the tops of the grass like fingers through hair, Chayton vanished again, not like a ghost, but like a prayer that waits to be finished. She stood in the stillness long after, not waiting for him, but letting herself be found. The warmth between them came not like thunder, not like fire leaping from spark to flame, but like embers buried deep beneath snow, slow to glow, slow to catch, but steady. The kind that waited, patient and sure, until the cold around it learned to trust its heat. Chayton came more often now, though never daily, never expected. Some mornings he'd appear with the dew, quiet as the mist over the fields, a bundle of herbs or a length of sinew for binding. Other times, at dusk, when the shadows grew long and Lena lay sleeping in her cradle with her fist curled around the fox figurine. He did not knock. He did not intrude. He simply came as the wind did, unasked for, but welcome. They began to speak, if only in small things. A nod, a name for a flower. Clara offered him tea once, and he accepted, sitting on the porch with legs crossed and eyes cast toward the horizon. They drank in silence, letting the steam do the talking. One morning, she found him kneeling beside her garden. The plants were thin, still struggling to thrive in the stubborn soil. He ran his fingers over a stalk of lettuce and said, "They grow better if they're not alone." She blinked, unsure if he meant the plants or something else. But she said nothing, just knelt beside him, her hands brushing against the dirt near his. Their arms nearly touched, but not quite. That space between them pulsed, not empty, not forbidden, but full of something that did not need hurrying. Chayton had a way of noticing without claiming. When Clara dropped a bucket and winced from an old ache in her ribs, he said nothing, only moved to lift it beside her. When Lena cried in the night and the wind howled like old grief, he came to the porch and stood there, not knocking, not asking, just letting his presence speak. "You are not alone tonight." They began sharing more than silence. He told her of his people, of the land before fences, of the rivers that knew his name. He spoke of his mother, who taught him the language of plants, and of his brother, who died before the snows came one year, taken by fever. His voice carried no blame, just memory. She told him little, at first, just of the sky she missed from her childhood home, and how her mother's hands always smelled of thyme. But in time, words slipped out like threads unraveling. She spoke of Thomas, of how he looked right through her the day Lena was born, how it hurt less to be struck than to be ignored, how she hated herself for not being surprised when he left. Chayton didn't interrupt. He simply listened, his stillness, like the trees, anchored, steady, giving shade. One evening, Clara sat on the porch steps with Lena asleep against her shoulder, her hair unbound and curling with the humidity. Chayton sat beside her, just close enough to feel the brush of his arm when she shifted. "I thought," she whispered, not looking at him, "that maybe I broke something when I gave birth. Like something inside me came loose, and now everything feels quieter than it should." He didn't answer right away. The stars blinked slowly overhead, and the wind carried the scent of pine. Then he said, "Not broken, just emptied. Makes room for something else." She looked at him then, really looked. His face was strong, but not proud. Not the kind that seeks to be known, but the kind that makes knowing feel safe. There was a softness at the corners of his mouth that hadn't been there weeks ago, a crease near his eye from watching closely. She thought he looked like someone who had been alone too long and learned how not to rush the company of others. She reached out, slow, like you would for a bird not used to the hand, and touched his wrist. His skin was warm. He didn't move away. The next morning, he was gone again. But the space he left behind didn't feel like absence anymore. It felt like promise. Rain came 2 days later, hard and sudden, the kind that turned dirt to mud and beat against the roof like fists. Clara ran outside to pull down the laundry and slipped in the yard, her side hitting the corner of the trough. Pain lanced through her ribs, sharp and sudden, and for a moment she lay there, breath gone. Lena cried from a porch. She staggered upright, cradling her ribs, soaked and cold. Chayton arrived at dusk, rain still falling in slow drizzles. He didn't ask, just saw the way she winced and went to the barn, returning with a bundle of roots and oil. He helped her inside, sat her by the hearth, unrolled the herbs. He didn't touch her skin, not at first. He simply asked, with a glance, and she nodded. His hands were sure, careful. Not healer's hands exactly, but hands that had tended wounds before and never taken more than was offered. Clara let her head fall back as he worked, let herself breathe through the ache. The baby stirred in her crib, but did not wake. "You didn't have to come," she whispered, eyes half closed. "I heard the storm," he said. And she knew he'd come not because she needed him, but because he wanted to. That night, they shared bread and quiet firelight. And though neither spoke of it, the silence was not the same as it had been. It held a hum beneath it now, a gentle, waiting warmth. Chayton stood to leave, but paused at the door. She looked up, her voice no louder than breath. "Do you believe people can be loved, even after they've stopped hoping for it?" He turned, eyes shadowed by the low lamp. His voice came soft and steady. "I believe love waits, even if it has to sit in the cold for years." She closed her eyes, letting those words settle in her chest like warmth under frost. He didn't stay that night, but the door closed soft behind him, and the wind no longer howled. When spring crept back across the land, Clara's garden began to bloom. Little things first. Lettuce. Tiny shoots of potato leaf. Marybelle brought more seed. Neighbors began to nod instead of whisper. And one morning, Clara found a new carving on her porch. A bird this time, wings tucked in as if sleeping. She placed it beside the fox in Lena's cradle. Outside, the wind shifted, warm and light. And in the far distance, the sound of hooves, steady, approaching, unhurried. She stood at the door and watched the road. Not waiting, just ready. The day Thomas returned, the air felt thick with warning. Clouds hung low, not storm-heavy, but close, like the sky had secrets it hadn't yet chosen to spill. Clara was in the field, her hands in the soil, when she heard the hoofbeats. Not Chayton's. Too heavy, too certain. They came with the rhythm of someone who believed the ground still owed him its shape. She straightened slowly, wiping her palms on her skirt, heart already tightening in her chest. Lena was in the cradle under the porch awning, asleep with her fingers curled around the bird Chayton had carved. Clara moved toward her without panic, but with purpose, each step measured. When she reached the porch and turned, Thomas was already dismounting. He hadn't changed much. Maybe leaner, meaner in the eyes. His boots were worn, his jacket dust-stained, but his presence was just as loud as it had been the day he left. He looked at Clara, like the months between them had been a pause in his sentence, not a chapter closed. "You look different," he said, voice rough, like gravel poured over memory. Thinner, tired. She didn't answer. Behind her, Lena stirred, then settled again. The sight of her calmed something in Clara, anchored her spine. Thomas stepped forward, bold in his ignorance. "I heard tell of you livin' out here with an Injun." The word landed like a slap, raising my child like some wild thing. "She isn't yours," Clara said, soft but firm. "You left." "I had cause," he snapped. "I wanted a boy. You gave me weakness." Clara didn't flinch. The woman who might have bowed to that voice was gone, buried with the old winter. She reached back, laid a hand on Lena's blanket. Her voice came steadier than she expected. "She's stronger than you'll ever be." Thomas's jaw twitched. He glanced past her at the land, at the fence newly mended, at the garden rose that no longer struggled. "You do all this alone?" She let the silence answer. He stepped onto the porch, boots heavy. "Too close." "Clara, you're my wife." "No," she said. "You buried that title when you walked out the door." "I still have rights," he growled, eyes sharp now, not pleading. "Possessing. That girl's got my blood. You think some red man can raise her better than me." The screen door creaked open behind her. She didn't need to turn. Chayton stepped out slow, unhurried, like the day hadn't changed shape. He carried no weapon, just a calm that drew the wind toward him. He didn't look at Thomas, not right away. He looked at Clara, at Lena, at the space around them that had grown, carefully, with time. Thomas laughed. "Well, ain't this fine? You hand yourself over to a savage and think you're better for it." Chayton said nothing. Stillness radiated from him like heat off stone. Clara stepped between them, not out of fear, but because her voice was stronger than fists. "You don't get to use that word here," she said, facing Thomas fully. "You don't get to come back and pretend you didn't choose to vanish." His expression twisted. "I made a mistake." "No," she replied, eyes steady. "You made a choice." I almost died bringing her into this world. You left us both for it." He stepped forward then, sudden, like anger might give him back his place. But Clara didn't move. Behind her, Lena began to cry. And that, more than any word, ended it. Because the sound of that child's voice, fragile, fierce, cut through the dust and sweat and memory, and Clara saw it land in Thomas like a stone. He flinched. Just once. "She doesn't know your voice," Clara said. "She only cries when there are strangers near." Thomas looked at the cradle, at the girl whose curls clung to her brow with sleep sweat, whose tiny fists beat against the air with instinct, not recognition. "You want to raise her with him?" Thomas spat, motioning toward Chayton. "You want her to grow up wrong?" Clara stepped aside, just enough for Chayton to take her hand. He didn't squeeze, just held it there, quiet and open. "She's growing up right," Clara said. "Because she's growing up safe." Thomas didn't speak again. His eyes flickered over them one more time, scanning for weakness, for regret. Finding none, he turned back to his horse, mounted with a grunt, and rode off. Not in rage. In something slower. Defeated, maybe, or simply lost. Clara didn't watch him go. She knelt beside Lena, lifted her gently into her arms, and pressed her lips to the child's forehead. The air felt lighter. They didn't speak for a long time. The porch held them in its quiet, the way old trees hold wind. When the baby fell back into sleep, Clara looked up at Chayton, her eyes shining not with fear, but with something fuller. "You didn't speak," she said softly. He brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "You didn't need me to." They sat down together, Lena between them. The bird and fox carvings rested on the porch rail, side by side. That evening, Clara brought out the bundle she'd been working on, a woven band, horsehair, and blue glass beads. She tied it around his wrist without asking. He didn't smile, but he held her gaze like someone anchoring themselves in deep water. "You're not him," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I saw the place where he left you. I saw you survive it." She leaned against his shoulder, and he didn't shift or stiffen. He simply let her rest. Later, when the sun dipped low, they walked the land together. She showed him where she planned to build a second coop. He told her which trees would be good for shade in summer. They didn't plan a life out loud. They simply stepped into it. Weeks passed, and the land bloomed. The carrots took, the corn grew high. Mary Bell visited and called Clara lighter in the face. Lena said her first word, "B.A.," while holding the fox in one hand and the bird in the other. It didn't matter what the word meant. It belonged to them. One night, under a prairie sky, so white it felt like breath itself, Clara stood beside Chayton and whispered, "You waited." His arms slid around her waist, sure and steady. "For a fire worth tending," he said. She looked up, the stars like salt spilled across black velvet. "What do you call something that comes late, but still arrives in time?" He kissed her forehead, voice low. "Home." And in the cradle, Lena dreamed. And in the house, the floor no longer creaked with loneliness. And in Clara's chest, the empty places filled, not all at once, but enough. Enough to stay. Enough to begin again. The fire had waited. And so had she.